being here. My name is Vicky Clark. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the policy director for Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes. I'm excited to welcome you to the Washington Bike Walk Roll Summit. We're excited to have you with us for this 4-day virtual event. And as I said, I'm thrilled to see people from around the state. We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The summit is virtual and those participating are joining us from many lands. Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes are two statewide organizations. And we acknowledge the land that our offices sit on in the Puget Sound today as the traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal nations. If you don't know whose land you're on, look in the chat in a minute where you'll find a link to a map that you can use to look up your place on the land. Without these communities, we'd not have access to the environment, and we take the opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land. Also want to note that this summit session is being recorded, and it, along with the other sessions, will be available at the end of the summit. So with that, the summit is hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes, you all know that. And I want to take a second to thank our sponsors, the Washington State Department of Transportation, Columbia Bank, and Darrow. And now, before we get to the keynote, I have the pleasure of introducing Cascade and Washington Bikes Executive Director, Lee Lambert, who I have the pleasure of working with every day. He took the helm at Cascade and Washington Bikes in September of 2021. Lee has over a decade of experience in nonprofit leadership in Washington State, and that prior to his nonprofit career, worked for US Senator Maria Camwell. He lives in Shoreline with his wife and 2 teenage children, learned to ride bikes in a church parking lot, and grew up in Tacoma, where he began exploring the region by bicycle, thanks to the mentorship of an uncle. He's ridden bikes throughout his life for transportation, commuting, recreation, and fitness, and you can, without doubt, see him on a Cascade ride. So with that, I would love to hand over to Lee.
Thank you, Vicki. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Bike Walk and Roll Summit. As Vicki mentioned, I'm Lee Lambert, the Executive Director of Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes. The theme of this year's summit is building just and resilient communities, but I assure you this isn't a developer conference. It's for all of you who bike, walk, and roll. In the coming days, we'll hear from many experts who are working to make our transportation system and our communities healthier, safer, and more equitable. Already today, we have learned about the efforts to decarbonize our transportation and land use policies. We've also learned about the Leafline Trail Coalition's vision, which will connect 4 counties in the Puget Sound region with a 900-mile network of multi-use trails. Can you imagine how great it will be to feel safe riding a bike from Everett to Tacoma? And this afternoon, Washington State Department of Transportation officials will discuss the new Complete Streets mandate. This new law will transform Washington communities across the state in the coming years. The Complete Streets requirement was a key provision in the historic Move Ahead Washington Transportation Package. This package includes a record $1.3 billion for biking and walking infrastructure, safe routes to schools, and a statewide bike safety education program for school children. These are incredibly exciting times for bike advocacy and active transportation, especially here in Washington. As Executive Director of Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes, I'd like to think it's no coincidence. Good policies don't just happen. They require hard work, organizing, meeting with elected officials, building coalitions, and learning from one another. This is what Cascade and Washington Bikes are here to do. For 53 years, Cascade has been pushing to make Washington more bike friendly. We are the nation's largest statewide bike club with almost 10,000 members. We teach the joys of bicycling, advocate for safe places to ride, and produce world-class rides and events, such as the summit. Washington Bikes, our political advocacy arm, is in Olympia and was instrumental in winning support for the Move Ahead Washington and its $1.3 billion of funding for active transportation. Now our challenge is to do the hard work of ensuring these resources are used equitably to ensure safe, active transportation throughout the state in all of our communities. Our challenge is to make real progress that transforms lives. We know that bicycling and walking are not just forms of recreation. They are the foundation of just resilient, healthy, and thriving communities. These are exciting times. This is just day one of the Washington Bike Walk and Roll Summit. I hope you stick around for in the coming days, well, as we share knowledge, we'll make new friends and find ways to partner with one another. On Monday, I'm looking forward to hearing Roger Millar, Washington State Transportation Secretary, give a welcome address and Q&A about how communities can tap into the record amounts of state and federal money that are available for active transportation. I'd now like to welcome Zabe Bent, Director of Design for the National Association of Transportation Officials, National Association of City Transportation Officials, and it's NACTO. Zabe has more than 20 years of experience in multimodal planning, complete street design, and community development. I'm eager to hear Zabe's presentation about how we can equitably scale up multimodal projects and create communities that are more just and resilient. Welcome, Zabe, and thank you for joining us. I urge everyone attending the summit today to follow Cascade and Washington Bikes online and use the hashtag WaBikesSummit to post about what you learned today. And just as a reminder, during Zabe's presentation, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat, and Vicky will be doing a moderated Q&A at the end of the presentation. Zabe, take it away.
Thank you, Lee, for that welcome, and thank you to the whole team for organizing and having me here. I am going to see if I remember how to share my screen. Okay. Hopefully you're all seeing a beautiful image of a road and safety transportation transformation project in Baltimore. And I'm just going to kick it off by saying that I'm going to talk a little bit about centering equity in transportation and really leave us with some thoughts and some questions about how to really think this through and to imagine, what people are facing at this moment and what it means to actually center equity. But first, let's see, there we go. I'll just explain what NACTO is, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, as Lee mentioned, and we are an organization that has members, which are city departments of transportation and transit agencies across about almost 100 cities in the US and Canada. And as you can see, we do have a good distribution, and we also have a few here in the Northwest. But our organization is probably best known for our urban design guides. And the goal here was really to look at the way that streets are transformed, look at the sort of mechanisms that cities and transit agencies use to do that work, and to iterate a system that focuses on what urban mobility looks like and urban mobility needs, because a lot of them are sort of focused in more highway applications, suburban and even rural applications. We see that we really needed to focus on what's happening at an urban level. Our goal as an organization, our mission, is to build cities as places for people with safe, sustainable, accessible, and equitable transportation choices that support a strong economy and vibrant quality of life. And that's because we see cities as places for people where people interact, no matter what mode of transportation they're using to get around, and also because cities are these vibrant locations. But keeping that in mind, we do need to sort of base our work in the trends that we're seeing now, the conditions that we're seeing now. And one of the top concerns that has been declared a public health crisis, in addition to the pandemic that we're experiencing now, is roadway safety. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration just last month released data that early estimates show that traffic fatalities are increasing for the first quarter of 2022. That is after a record year last year and a record year the previous year and a record year the previous year to that as well. And so this is something that's very concerning. Obviously, we want to make sure that roads are safe for all users. And we also want to make sure that roads feel like a safe place to be, no matter what type of transportation you're using. In urban areas, arterials make up about 15% of streets. but they are 73% of traffic deaths. We do see this as a huge concern because a lot of times, folks like to think about transportation projects, transportation dollars, infrastructure dollars, and sort of spread them around equally. But if we want to really make a dent in where we see the problems happening, we need to focus on what the data is actually telling us. 52% of urban arterials in the US are state-owned. That means that when we get angry at our city officials, sometimes that's warranted, and sometimes they sort of look at us like, we can't do anything about that. We want your help. We want to be part of the solution as well. And so we want to make sure that we're paying attention to what's happening and where. A study of the country's most dangerous streets for pedestrians found that 75% have speed limits of 30 miles per hour or more, and 75% border low-income neighborhoods. When we think about the impact that has on individuals, we want to think about the types of equity that this helps us to understand. And I think the first thing that we are learning as transportation officials and as transportation practitioners is modal equity. This is something that we pick up pretty easily nowadays. It doesn't mean we're successful at it, but at least we understand the concept. And so looking at people walking, particularly in lower income areas, they are killed at far higher rates. And this is, again, looking at just pedestrians and sort of where they're located. And so this is modal and income equity. But then we also want to look at ethnicity and race, and looking at people of color, particularly Native and Black Americans, are more likely to die while walking than any other race or ethnic group. And part of the reason I say that is because we want to make sure that we're looking at equity in different ways. We want to understand age, income, ethnicity, physical ability, all these different parameters to make sure that we're thinking about all of the people and all the types of people that make up our communities, which make up our cities. But when we think about that, we have to understand what safety means to all of those different types of people. Safety can't just mean safe from crashes. There's physical safety and what that means, and most people think of that in terms of crossing the street, but simply walking down the street, biking down the street, making sure that people feel safe and comfortable and welcome in the public spaces is critical. We recently released a working paper for our urban bikeway design guide called Breaking the Cycle that looks at the laws that prevent safe and inclusive biking and really tried to elevate the need to remove superfluous regulations and laws from our system and to understand the underpinnings of those as well. When we think about where we're planning our projects and where we're planning our sort of networks, a lot of times we'll say, well, you weren't supposed to be there, or the engineer might say we weren't supposed to be there, or media or whoever. But it's important to think through what that means to the average cyclist or pedestrian or transit rider. And one of the things that we looked at with our recent report, Breaking the Cycle, is just what are projects doing? What is the impact of projects? And this one in particular is on Prospect Park in Brooklyn, New York. And we want to make sure that people understand how individuals make decisions about the infrastructure that they use. People don't put themselves at risk without a reason. It is impossible to make a good decision if the infrastructure doesn't let you, if the infrastructure simply is not there. So here is a before condition where 50% of people on bikes were riding on the sidewalk. And it seems like that's a reasonable place to be if you're a cyclist rather than riding in the street, because there is no bike facility here and there's a nice wide sidewalk there. But once you add a bike facility, that number goes from 50% to 3% of people on bikes riding on the sidewalk currently. And that's a really big change and sends a very different message about who is welcome in the street and the impact that that has. And the sort of connection back to breaking the cycle is obviously if you are not riding on the sidewalk, if you have an actual bike facility there, you're less likely to be stopped for things like citations for riding on the sidewalk or riding without a helmet, or all sorts of different things. So I encourage you to check out that document. But I would also just take a step back and think, how do we embed equity in our work? I think a lot of people would like a step 1, step 2, step 3. I'm actually instead going to say what are some of the things that you should think about? How should you sort of frame the work that you're doing? And just start by saying that we should ground our work in the values and outcomes. A lot of times we sort of want to track the metrics that we have in mind, and I'll walk through some of the other ways that our member cities have been thinking about this and talking about this with their constituents and officials. Measure what matters, focus on the risks, determine who and where, and talk to them, make sure that we're actually thinking about the impact on individuals, communities. Change policies for broader impact. So it's not just about every little project that we do, but looking at the impacts of policy change once we see trends. Embedding opportunities in other projects as well, and other activities, and being proactive. This is really critical. I think a lot of times we want to have every T crossed, every I dotted, and we're sort of trained, particularly as engineers and planners, to think through the full process and to come up with the single answer that will work. Sometimes it's more important to just do something and to be proactive about some form of change. So I'll start by just talking about how to ground work and values, and give this example from Minneapolis, where they talked through what the project was about. This is for their citywide streets program and Vision Zero and traffic safety, and looking at impacts and specifically focusing on how the community would frame this. But they also wanted to make sure that people understand that a life lost on our streets is an actual person, and they assigned names to some of the people who were there and shared those names out, or some of the people who had been killed on the streets and shared those names out. And so they're sort of pairing the types of things that we want to see with the impacts that it might have, or the impact that it has had. They're also looking at measuring what matters, so focusing on risks, pedestrian crashes, where they're occurring, how they're occurring, so that they can figure out how to focus their attention and their work. And then looking at the corridors and actually coming up with a program that reflects both the hard sort of quantitative data as well as the community feedback and the other qualitative data that they could collect. In Minneapolis's case, 9% of streets play host to 70% of people killed or seriously injured. And that is a pretty substantial number and proportion. It also allowed them to designate particular high crash corridors to come up with a program that is not really necessarily seen as equal, but really is equitable. And again, in terms of focusing on the areas where they're likely to have the greatest impact. Another example here is Atlanta, where this small number of streets has a huge impact. It's 88% of fatalities and 52% of severe injuries. And again, really making sure to say that these are the high priority corridors to focus on. It doesn't mean that no other street will be touched with any other improvement, but they really need to focus their work in these areas. And another example from San Francisco with their Vision Zero and high injury network, where again, they were hoping to make sure that people understand where the crashes are occurring and how to convert that into projects and priorities. They also overlaid, again, in this case, their communities of concern, which is the designation that they have for low-income communities, communities of color, seniors, and people who rely on walking and transit as their primary means of transportation. So the other note that I would make is just, again, looking at changing policies too, and looking at that systemic impact. Here's an example from Portland, where they're looking at changing speed limits and have changed their speed limit from 25 to 20 miles per hour as their sort of base limit. And they have a whole rubric around how they do that work and how they have done that work. The impact for vehicles that are speeding at just slightly above is just a 2% change. But again, the high-end speeders, these are the folks who would have the greatest impact on severe injuries, and as well as the occurrence of a crash to begin with, changed by 47%. And that's, again, from changing the speed limit. And I think a lot of times we think, there has to be one or the other. We can focus on either changing our speed limits or making design changes. And the reality is that we need to do both, partly because it sends a message to those high-end speeders, but also because the way our system is set up, and in many, many cases, cities and city officials are either unable to make changes, or simply it makes the changes easier from a policy standpoint if the posted speed changes, because it allows them to change the design speed of the street. And the design speed is the thing that controls, how fast a street operates or feels to drivers and other users. So the design speed is set in a way that impacts lane transitions, curb radii, many other things. So changing the speed limits is, in some cases, the thing that enables you to actually get to those design treatments. And in other cases, it simply sends a strong message to drivers. Another component is to make sure that you're embedding opportunities in other street design activities, so that there's always a way to move a project forward and to sort of make double duty or sort of multimodal impact, and to extend the reach of your programs. And so here, it's just looking at all the different types of projects, which may not seem like safety projects, may not seem like equity projects, but again, by doing double duty, we're helping to move the program and extend the program's reach. Here's just one example from San Francisco as part of their bus program, particularly on their priority network. You have dedicated bus lanes, and that's sort of the big thing that people think about. Bus stop changes and bus bulb outs, but also pedestrian bulb outs and other safety improvements are embedded here. And so you get to see some of the other changes that are part of such a major project. Here's one example where they created a new crossing where there is a pedestrian overpass where there was not an ad-grade crossing at all as part of the bus project. And here's the final look at what that looks like. And the ability to simply cross the street at grade is such a huge transformation. But on top of that, they really tried to make sure that it fit in with the local neighborhood, here in this case in Japantown, to make sure that that change and that access is really stitched into the local flair, both with the street changes as well as the bus stop changes. There is some really encouraging news with the adoption of the National Roadway Strategy, the release of the new infrastructure bill. We are seeing that some more local control is embedded there. One of the things that a lot of states, or rather a lot of cities, find is that the state regulations are not always as flexible as their local regulations. And so one thing that is new and included in the infrastructure law is explicit permission to use federally recognized design guidance of their choice when implementing federally funded projects on city-owned streets. Still city-owned streets, so not all streets, but it does make a huge difference when there is local control. The ability to actually design to local design standards using this rule is truly helpful. The other thing I'll say quickly is just that, NACTO tries to embed equity in all of the work that we do. All of our guides have some way of addressing equity, and obviously it's simply focusing on urban sustainable mobility helps that along, but we do try to make sure to elevate that work. And we are explicit in that in some of our other projects. City limits, again, setting safe speeds on urban streets using a safe system approach is certainly one of them. The Urban Bikeway Design Guide, where we're focusing our working paper projects or policies and themes on how to deliver bike projects that are sustainable and hopefully more efficient. as well as more equitable, and looking at some of the policy implications of some of the new findings and trends that we're seeing. Our city grants program, Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery, which focused on a combination of city officials and community groups working together to submit projects for sort of innovative projects that would affect neighborhoods that are marginalized and have faced particular impacts from the pandemic. But again, the city program had to come in with the community partner and to show that there is that stewardship and collaboration. And most recently, our newest policy guidance on called Move That Bus, on tactics for transforming transit in 2 years, particularly focused on the humble bus and the ability to make real and lasting changes with the bus system very quickly, which is absolutely necessary for the climate crisis that we are currently facing. And again, looking at ways to make those changes, not just within the transit network, the transit system, but thinking through what is the ecosystem that supports transit, and gearing this guidance towards the city officials, to elected officials, to advocates, and others who can support transit and transit network development. One of the reasons that we focus our efforts in this way is because we feel strongly as an organization, and I personally feel strongly, that the streets we create today provide the foundation of recovery for generations to come. Many of us are fully aware that the streets projects that we see have been there for decades, if not longer, and we can make changes if we try, if we focus our attention on doing this work in a way that centers equity. Those changes can have a huge impact on the communities that we serve, the communities that host our cities and make up our cities. So I'm going to leave us all with a few questions and thoughts. If we think about streets as public spaces, we really do want to think about who has access to work, to school, and play spaces. Much of our system today is very much focused on work, but who deserves safe and convenient access to more than work? And what does that look like in your cities? How can streets play a role? What is the greatest need? Again, not just looking at streets for mobility and such, but also what are some of the other changes that can be made? What current activities are focused on access, economy, health, and environment? We've seen a lot of change in the way that streets are used, and a lot more possibility and a lot more innovation as a result of particularly the early days of the pandemic. And we're really encouraged to see some of those changes being made permanent in different cities. We hope that the innovation also sticks around so that people can try out new things and find new ways of addressing ongoing concerns. Also looking at how we can remove silos. More and more communities want clear points of contact. A lot of times we will send someone out and try to figure out, that I am the bike planner, I am the transit planner, I can only talk about these things, but to the community, typically that person is a representative of the city or a representative of the transit agency or whoever it is. And it's really important to figure out to recognize I have more access to the rest of the city sort of ecosystem than the average community member. And it's important to figure out how can I bring back that information and either allow it to change the project in a way that is more beneficial to the community, or to pass it on to someone else who can, and to use that sort of collaboration among city agencies and to benefit communities. This also leads to streamlining projects, especially with ever more dire budget conditions, particularly for transit. We're incredibly encouraged by the newest act out of Congress and from the president's office, and sort of seeing a new investment in in transportation over time, billions of dollars over the next 5 years, which is more than we've had in previous years, But the question is it enough? What is it going to take? And again, to get to the outcomes and goals that we have in mind. And in particular, looking at some of the ongoing maintenance and operating needs, and figuring out how can we really streamline that work and learn from that experience. And then finally, are we reaching the intended users? When I was running projects like this in a fair amount of different cities, one of the questions that I would always ask when we were sort of analyzing the work, analyzing the feedback, and even sort of analyzing some of the decisions that we were making, who is not in the room? You know, whose input is not represented here? How are those people helped or harmed? You know, who is the target audience and target user for the work that we are doing? And how do we bring them in? How do we make sure that we are actually making a substantial or substantive change in the infrastructure and the transportation experience of those that we are trying to help? Are we reaching them? And if not, how do we bring them in? And that's it. I'm going to turn it back over to the Cascade team, but I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Zabe, for that overview. That was great. And I know that folks have posted several questions. And so before I jump to them, I do want to plug. So I wrote very briefly, very high level, your Zabe's kind of parting thoughts. And I want to invite folks to think about how do those parting thoughts bring up questions about projects in your community or challenges that you are facing. You have this opportunity right now where we have Zabe Ben of Necto. And so what questions does all of this bring to mind for you? We have 40 minutes to have this conversation. And so this feels luxurious, but I know that time goes really quickly. So let me hop over. Okay, I'm gonna start with something that's pretty high level. So regarding the Move That Bus document, something that I've seen a lot in bike advocacy work is, and you were just speaking to it about multimodal and individual modes. Can you speak to the tensions, trade-offs between transit speed times and protected bike lanes, like the intersection, right? Like there's a lot going on at those intersections, and getting the bus through is one thing, but also we know that you mentioned this in your presentation, we know that intersections are the place where there are the most crashes of the most severity. And so from a policy perspective, how do we think through managing those inevitable tensions between modes? Yeah.
This is not an easy question to answer. If it were easy, we would have done it already, probably. And I think this is one of those moments where I kind of want to take a step back, because a lot of times, and I remember this very clearly when I was running projects, as well as when I was riding, buses and biking before I was a planner or an engineer, it always seems like there's some tension between buses and bikes, and therefore that tension must mean competition. And no, I reject that notion outright. We should be seeing buses, biking, walking at the very least as complementary. And I would love to be able to see, cars pulled into that, and to really have a transportation network that allows people to use any of the modes that make sense, because they're all competitive with each other in the best sense, in that, like, you have good access no matter how you want to get around, and that the most sustainable modes are prioritized. That said, most of the places that we are operating are cities that have mature infrastructure and architecture, and it's all about trade-offs. And so we do have a document, don't give up at the intersection. We have very interesting titles for all of our documents when we can. And it's a critical question. We really should be thinking about, how do we make sure to carry this lane for whatever user it is, whatever mode of transportation, through the intersection. That's where the conflict points are going to be. most prime. And in that case, I would say that it's about figuring out who needs to be there, who has no other alternative, and also what is the goal? What is the type of outcome that we are trying to create? What's the type of interaction that we are trying to create? And we've seen a lot of new bike projects go forward, new bike boulevards, open streets, shared streets in the last couple of years. And we would love to see more of that. We would also love to see more priority for the bus, because we're going to be able to move people in greater numbers. But I don't think it has to be a competition. I think we need to figure out what is the future that we want to see and what configuration makes that work. It's probably not the most satisfying answer, but there's a lot of info and don't give up at the intersection.
I know it's a tricky question. I started on a tricky one. How can we create solutions to the historic and disproportionate impact of work like highway creation and expansion? Another giant topic, a difficult question.
So luckily, we're seeing some leadership coming forward now with the Recovery Act, and looking at, I think it's $1 billion over 5 years, to talk through reconnecting communities and to actually realize projects at that level, to make sure that there are ways that we can think about how highways have created deep separation between communities, how bridges have been prioritized in one neighborhood or another, or how projects in general have been used to divide communities, and to figure out ways to reconnect and restitch those communities. That's certainly one thing. I'm not necessarily a proponent of taking down all highways, and people sort of, oh my gosh. I think sometimes the question is where, certainly it's important to figure out what was the harm that was done, so that we acknowledge that harm, and then figure out what is the path forward now, given what people need now. And in some cases that might mean tearing down the highway. In some cases it might mean building a bridge above it. It might mean taking a lane and devoting it to transit on that highway and making sure that the community has access to that transit. In other cases it might mean looking at what is actually there on that roadway and slowing it down. It might mean adding bus shelters or bus stops along that highway. I cannot stress enough how distressing it is to see express buses that have highway stops on off-ramps with like a Jersey barrier or nothing in some cases. And that happens a lot in our sort of more outer urban areas and sort of edging the suburban areas, but they're still in cities and they're still urban environments. And we need to make sure that transit riders and cyclists and pedestrians have access to transportation that affords them safety and dignity. And I think that's part of what this program is intending to do.
Thank you. This is so rapid fire. This is like a lot of giant questions for you. Okay, switching gears again. How does this work and the themes that you've been talking about translate to smaller communities, whether that's suburban areas, more rural areas, even communities, cities less than 5,000, where the realities of funding and design are really different, as well as obviously the geographic context, than large metro areas?
Yeah. I would start by saying that I think often we think that there's a huge difference in the needs of folks in urban environments versus rural environments. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. I mean, you might be walking longer distances if you're in a rural environment, you might be sort of biking or what have you, and certainly you might end up driving. But you still want those roads to be safe. You still want to have sidewalks where people are walking. You might not need bike lanes because the volumes are low, but if the speeds are high, you might still do. And so really thinking through what the conditions are rather than simply saying, well, this is rural and that's urban and the needs are different, it's sort of a bit of a red herring that I think this is another case where that to me is an equity consideration that we need to really dig into further. And when I think about dangerous by design and the data that Smart Growth America collects annually, year after year, Black and Native American people are among the people who face the most traffic deaths, and some of those are in tribal areas, which are rural, and some of them are urban. But it's important to really look at what the conditions are and the needs of those users. So that's the first thing. Just don't start by saying, oh, well, it's rural, therefore different. Yes, different, but look at the conditions. The other thing I would say is that in smaller communities, there's usually a main street, and that's an urban enough environment as well. And so it's important to think through what are the needs of those, moving through a main street, and what does that look like? And to find some examples that may seem like they are set in an urban environment and therefore not the same, but if the traffic volumes are similar and the biking needs are similar, and et cetera, the sort of the building heights, the activity, the conflict points, then that starts again to look like an environment that could be useful and comparable. And then in terms of opportunities, there are some new funds that we're seeing. We're also seeing more attention paid to smaller communities. There are lots of organizations that do work specifically with smaller communities, sort of local innovation or sort of different types of assistance. League of American Cities is one that comes to mind, or National Leadership Council. So there are organizations that do focus on cities that are smaller than like 100,000 and even smaller than that. But again, to me, it's about the conditions. And if you see conditions that resonate with you in our guidebooks, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to figure out how to adapt it to your local condition.
Thank you. We have a few questions that are about NACTO and accessibility to the guidebooks and how you do your work. So I'm going to focus on those for a little bit. Are all NACTO design manuals available without cost to local advocates?
No, not really, sort of. Joking. The book itself is available for purchase as a hardcover bound book, and you can get that through our website. It will take you there. However, the information is also available on our website. It's just as a book, it's available for purchase. But if you go to the publication that you're looking for, each of the sections are sort of online for you to look at. The renderings, all of that stuff, it's all on our website. But the book you can.
Right, and the guidance, I think the white papers that you're putting out this year, they're all free, right?
Say it again. The guidance.
The guides that you're putting out this year.
Yeah, so all of our sort of interim guidance that isn't a bound book is available on our website. And that information, like Move That Bus, is just a PDF. You can just download that. Our working papers on the bike guide, also, you can just download those. Any of our policy guidance, Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery, things like that, they're all just available on our website. We really try to make sure that while our design manuals and our guidance is by cities and for cities, meaning that we try to make sure that engineers and practitioners, planners, designers are the ones who are sort of vetting and pulling the information together. We do want to make sure that the precedents, that the sort of policies, the processes are available as examples to all.
It feels like we have a lot of advocates who are part of this audience, right? And so I guess my plug, it would be, if your community is not a if your city is not an ACTO city, encourage them to be, right? That feels like a step towards your city being having a lot more access to the NACTO best practices and just the mindset that I think Zabe is speaking to. I think
I do want to say one more thing really quickly.
Yeah.
I think when people think of a street design manual, they think of something like the Green Book or like ASHTO's guides or whatever that are like hundreds of dollars. They're like less than $100. They're less than $50. I mean, they're just we really do try to make sure that it's accessible to folks. So I would encourage you to poke around and see what you can find.
So another sort of NACTO-esque question, is NACTO doing any work with colleges, universities to change engineering curriculum? I've run up against this a lot, as I'm sure you have, and many others. I think we need more people graduating with an understanding of the kinds of approaches that you include in your guides. What are you thinking around that?
In a perfect world, I would do this all the time, all day, every day. I'm really personally interested in systemic and long-term change, and I try to take the long view, and that's definitely in changing hearts and minds. We don't really have the capacity to do that all the time. I'm happy to sort of take that back to our team and sort of figure out what more we can do. That said, we do have different ways that we interface with folks as part of our training program. We also have, different types of people at all levels of understanding in grad school. I think we have had undergrads as well, and interns and such come to our conference. And each of us at one point or another has been a lecturer or guest or what have you in someone's university classroom at some point. It's something that I think more and more of us need to do. And I also think, designing streets for kids is another component of work that we collaborated with the Global Designing Cities initiative. I really encourage you to look at that manual as well, Designing Streets for Kids at gdci.org or globaldesigningscities.org. I will figure this out and put it in the chat if Wendy doesn't beat me to it. But Designing Streets for Kids is another way of really thinking about changing the way that we think about users of the street and making sure that our youngest users are encouraged to, thank you very much, Barb, even our youngest users are encouraged to see public spaces and particularly streets as places that are safe for them as well.
That's great. I think your sort of acknowledgement that we don't all have the capacity in the world that we want, right? Like we can't all be in all places and there are limits to our roles, right? And so I guess it leads me to the question of, as you're having these conversations with cities and often doing amazing work, maybe sometimes the city doesn't want to take the recommendation that you have. I'm wondering what kind of what themes there are around the sort of challenges that you face in getting the infrastructure that is safer, frankly, and thinking about our audience of advocates. Like, where do you see like where your work ends and advocates' work starts, and what can advocates do to help you in your role, and vice versa?
Yeah. So I come from the public sector side. I have worked at state and city regional organizations. I've also done community development work as an advocate eons ago in a prior life, it feels. And I've been a consultant. And I would say that each group has a part to play. And I think there's an element of sort of figuring out what that part is. And I kind of say like, know your role, which can come off a little bit standoffish at times for some people. But the goal there is really truly to understand what is everyone's individual role? What are the constraints that city staff are operating within, or transit staff are operating within? And understanding where are you in the landscape? So, I was talking about urban arterials and how many of them are on the national highway system and how many of them are basically state owned. That means that the city might have plans, and the city might say, hey, this is, one of our top 5 priorities on the high injury network, but they don't own the street. So figuring out who should you be angry with, right? How do you direct your attention? How do you find, common cause with or against a different organization? And how can you help amplify what the city needs versus when do you need to push the city further? And that's one of the reasons, quite honestly, that our manuals and our policy documents are meant to be available to everyone. We want everyone to see, like, this is a precedent. If you are a city staffer, you can take this to your elected official or into, a public meeting or in front of any naysayer and say, oh my gosh, look how cool we could be. But you also might be an advocate who is seeing a city official who's just like, I can't get any traction. Someone else needs to be the one to say this or what have you, and recognize sort of who you're dealing with. And I think that's really critical, because sometimes the city isn't doing enough, and sometimes the city is trying so hard and they're secretly crying at their desk at night, right? Like, it just depends. Like, figure out what universe you're in, and go from there. And it really does make a difference to figure that out, because it's one of the other reasons, which I didn't talk about the MUTCD I think at all in this presentation, which is sort of mind-blowing now that I think about it, because I talked about it for months every day. But looking at what are the systems in place that enable or hinder or simply sort of slow down the process, and how you can be an advocate for the city as much as for the city work. That was a very long answer. I'm sorry.
That was so good. Okay, I'm just getting reorganized here. Okay, so switching gears to some other questions. It's a long question. How do we deal with the houseless crisis pedestrian death? In Portland, Oregon, we had this is one of the, I'm reading from someone's question. So in Portland, Oregon, we had 70% of pedestrian deaths of people here without an address or site of death was at ramps to or from highways, for example, where camps are present. Does this mean that other 30% are really being helped by our reduced speeds, calming, intersections, etc.? Question mark. This seems to be a new line item of deaths. I don't know that I read that correct. I think I read that correctly. That was a lot.
Okay, I'm gonna assume that there might possibly be a nuance that I'm missing, but as I understand it, it's sort of, how do we address what seems to be a severe problem, and depending on what city you're in, but in many cities, of pedestrian deaths, particularly among people who are unhoused. And I think it's Jessie Singer who in her book, There Are No Accidents, talks about if we were, or maybe she just did this in a separate talk, but if we planned for the sort of the drunk pedestrian, then that might be a way for us to protect against pedestrian deaths in general. I have a really, really hard time sort of planning for the lowest common denominator of drivers. Like, I'm not going to plan for the drunk driver, but there's some like equalizing force behind that essentially says, like, if we simply make streets safer for everyone, then this incorporates sort of the most vulnerable users. And what a vulnerable user looks like can vary depending on where you are. And this is something that's really critical to understand. So, you might be in a city that is majority Black, and so your sort of lens on what equity looks like is really about race, but it could be about housing It could be about income. It could be about age. And I think it's important to make sure that we're trying to understand like who is the most vulnerable among us, where are they located, and what are the systems that need to change. I don't necessarily think that that we have to change the strategies around this because there are people who are unhoused. I think we should be doing that because they're people. We should be improving pedestrian safety because there are people dying. Where they are located is incredibly problematic because in many cases it's, you know, if it's an encampment by a highway or a highway off-ramp, which in many cases the city is not responsible for. And so that has to be a more concerted effort among agencies at multiple levels to make that change. But it's worth doing because they're people.
Thanks for that. Back into question mode. I'm sorry. Just too many windows. Also just too many windows currently. Okay. Is there data available to compare specific designs for safety and usage benefits? For example, if a county proposed to build a bike lane in between parking and travel lanes, is there a source to say moving it to the curbside of parking would result in X fewer injuries and Y more usage?
So the question is the decision or the impact or both?
It's data around the impact. I think in order to influence the decision, right? If you improve the example was if you improve, essentially if you move a bike lane to be a parking protected bike lane versus parking by the curb, do we have a magic way of measuring that? Do we have a magic way of measuring that? I mean, it would seem it's like on a given project.
Sorry,
say again. Oh, I was just thinking, it sounds like it's on a given project, it would be really different, but I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I'm not aware of anything that is that straightforward. That's sort of like an adjustable tool like that. I'll have to think on that, and whoever that is, like, email me or tweet at me or something, and I can follow up if there's something. We do have a lot of information on things like that on the bike guide website, or sorry, the Cities for Cycling website, which I can drop in if somebody doesn't beat me to it. But I'm not aware of something that's so straightforward that you have like a calculator, which is what that question sounds like. But feel free to re-up. That's not right.
I think so. Okay. All right. Okay. So throughout the pandemic, we've seen a huge shift in the discussion about safety and in regards to traditional enforcement. What do you see as a relationship between enforcement and safety for people biking, walking, and rolling?
I would go back to the example of Prospect Park West in Brooklyn and just say, thank you, Wendy. What is the thing that is being enforced, and is that thing a reasonable thing to begin with? I think when it comes to enforcement, it's really important because enforcement is embedded in so many other system norms and harms, that it's important to figure out what is the thing that we are enforcing, and is there a better way to accomplish the outcome that we are actually looking for? If the outcome is safety and people are being harmed by the policy, I don't care if it's one person or 100 people. That is not the intention of that program or that policy. So we need to look at why that unintended outcome is occurring and remove the need for it, or strengthen some other element of the program. So I would say, what are you enforcing? Is there a way to do it through design? Is there a program that can lessen the impact? Like, what is it that we're trying to get at? This is one of the reasons that our team took on Breaking the Cycle, really looking at whether there is a connection to safety for some of the laws that we have on our books for biking. I can't remember, like one of the most outlandish things, I can't remember exactly how it was worded, but you could be stopped for having an unclean tire. What? Like, how is that keeping you safe or not safe? You know, like why, like, I think a really good example that is, again, unintended consequences, things like having to register your bike. Because if your bike is stolen and at some point in the future it is found, which very rarely do people even look for the bikes, or specifically law enforcement does not have the resources to look for the bikes, or maybe the desire, depending on where you are. So what is the point of stopping someone to check if their bike is registered? And who are the people who are typically stopped to discover whether or not their bike is registered? People who look like me. And so what is the safety outcome of that? And if there isn't a clear line to safety, even if, you know, maybe there is something, if it's causing harm, we should not be doing it, or we should figure out a better way to do it.
Thank you. Okay, I have another long question here. Good question, long. A lot of design and operations analysis puts numbers on benefits to drivers, but no numbers for benefits to people walking and rolling. Benefit cost analysis. What resources or metrics can you point people to so that those needs and benefits are included in the decisions? So value of time savings because of crosswalk timing supports pedestrian movements, for example, not just a driver waiting time at the red light. I apologize, I'm doing a terrible job of reading people's questions here. It's also in the chat.
No, you're doing quite well, I think, but yeah, if I'm missing the point of your question based on the interaction between me and Vicky, feel free to re-up. I would say that there are quite a few cities that are trying to take this on to think through two things. One, whether or not, or sort of how rather, to move away from just looking at driver delay or driver impacts, and particularly the congestion impact and the delay impact that tends to be the reason that so many otherwise worthy projects are either slower or stopped. There are many cities that are looking at that. I would say that San Francisco is one that has simply changed their transportation impact measure, and several other cities in California are doing the same. That's one thing. It's just like, can you change the one impact measure that changes the way that we think about transportation impacts? The other thing to look at is a broader analysis. A broader analysis of your evaluation framework, really thinking through what the outcomes are that you're looking for and what the measures are that you need to capture. Like, what are the metrics that are actually going to tell you that it's more accessible, that it is more connected? What are the metrics that allow you to create a more holistic picture of the project besides this one thing that is driver impact or benefit, or even specifically like mobility. Mobility is not the end. It's not the outcome for a lot of people. It's the thing that gets you to the thing. So measure the thing, or the change in that, in some cases. And so lots of projects are now incorporating a more well-rounded evaluation framework so that they can look at metrics on a broader scale.
Kinds of themes of those evaluation frameworks? I mean, are you talking about multimodal level of service, or the level of things I know, level of traffic stress, or is it?
Yeah, all of those things. I think level of service is just one thing, and that's kind of my point. Like, when we think about level of service, most people think of auto level of service, and then we move towards multimodal level of service. But that's still just about the need to move. And that's not about the use of the street overall and the impact that it has on accessibility. So if I am moving through a corridor at a specific speed or what have you, like, it's nice that I'm moving faster. But if I'm only moving faster to a certain point and then I still need to transfer to get to something else, but you didn't improve that transfer point, then, so I get there faster. I'm getting there faster and now I'm waiting on a bus that doesn't have a time transfer, or I'm waiting in a really uncomfortable place at 9 o'clock at night with no lighting or something like that. And so the overall project impact is sort of broader than just the transportation level of service. It's looking at what is the benefit of the project and thinking about an evaluation framework that incorporates all of those other elements. And a lot of times we forget that transportation projects come with street trees, lighting, community boards, all kinds of things that sort of change the character of a neighborhood. And that can be good or bad. But if we don't talk about it and measure it and include it in the way that we're assessing that, then it makes it really difficult to understand that. And it makes it also really difficult for communities to trust that we get their concerns and that we are incorporating them into what the project looks like and what it needs to be.
Oh, I really like this critique of multimodal level of service. Can we talk a little bit about the level of traffic stress? I feel like I'd love your take on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about that for a while.
I mean, let me be more specific. So in terms of like whether you've seen it work.
Necessarily a bad metric. It's just, if it's the only metric that you're using, then it has to be a really strong metric. And I don't think either of these are strong enough on their own if the project is doing other things. And the project should be doing other things. We are facing a transit crisis. We're facing, we're trying to dig out of a pandemic. We are facing a traffic crisis. We are in a justice crisis. Like, there's so much going on right now. If you are building a single purpose project, you're probably building the wrong project. I can't say that for everything, which is why I say probably, but if you are building a single purpose project, it better be a really, really good purpose. And the best way to know that is to evaluate it from multiple angles. So if you're just thinking about level of traffic stress, what else is the project doing? That is important. And that number should be moving in the right direction, like that qualitative or quantitative analysis, it should be moving in the proper direction. But your project should be doing more. And that's hard now, especially given, the budget envelope that we're in, but we're seeing more attention to projects that are doing more, and those projects are more competitive, and they should be, because there's a lot going on right now. There are no silver bullets. There's like single purpose work, especially like highways, which are literally single mode, single use. What is that for? Who is that for?
Yeah, so true. Okay, we got through all the questions. And so we have a couple of minutes left, so that means I get to ask another question. But I will plug, next session is at 4 o'clock. This is the discussion of the Complete Streets requirement for state projects, which was part of the Move Ahead Washington transportation package that was passed this spring. I'm excited about that one as well as this one. And so my last question for you, Zabe, is what are you most excited about? You just named a lot of challenges, right? Like we're in a really challenging environment. And so what gives you hope? What are you excited about?
This is a hard question, Vicki. I wish I'd had this question before so that I could think about it overnight. I think attention, which is a really maybe less satisfying response, but I think the fact that people are paying attention to more than they would have in the past, I find that encouraging, that people are looking at what else we can do. Is there some new angle that I should be considering this thing? I hope it doesn't make people hesitant to act. So that is one thing, but I do think that people paying attention to more than just the sort of basics and trying to find ways to be innovative, trying to find ways to move things forward, and looking at the sort of broader permutations, trying to find, precedents for new ideas, that I find encouraging. I think it allows us to create connections. It allows us to act on innovation, and it allows us to see projects in new and different lights. And I hope we do more of that, because, as I said, we've got a huge challenge ahead of us, if we're gonna try to get through, again, all the different crises that we're facing at this moment.
Thank you. That's a good answer. Thank you. And thank you for this conversation. I got a lot out of it. And I'm sure that everyone else did too. Thank you. You are awesome and incredibly busy. And so thank you for spending the last hour with us. And thank you to everyone else who joined us for that hour. And the next session is at 4 o'clock. Okay.
Thank you
Thank you
all.
so much.
Thank you, Vicky.